Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories.
An airplane is the safest means of transportation. Alas, even today, some of them may fall. But what modern passenger planes can't do is disappear without a trace, and for no reason. And yet, there is a history of Flight 370. On the night of the 8th of March, 2014, Boeing 777 departs from the airport of the capital of Malaysia. The destination point of Chinese Beijing is a regular daily flight with the company China Airlines. There are more than 200 passengers and crew members on board. 30 minutes after takeoff, the ship's captain will contact the Earth for the last time. In 40 minutes, the Boeing will disappear not only from radar. He will disappear altogether along with 200 passengers. As a result, this case will become one of the main mysteries in the history of aviation.
The disappearance of Malaysia Airlines Flight.
Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 disappeared.
The Malaysia Airlines flight has gone missing.
Several countries will participate in the investigation of the incident and the search for the aircraft. Several years and hundreds of millions of dollars will be spent. And yet, until now, no one, starting from the official authorities and ending with the participants of conspiracy forums, can give an exact answer to what happened. Someone hijacked the plane. There was a terrorist attack. The equipment failed. The captain took his own life. The plane was hit by lightning or a meteorite. He was shot down by the military. Those who are connected with aviation know very well that a large modern passenger plane cannot just disappear. Advanced equipment on board the ship, radars on the ground, satellites in space. All this shows exactly where the plane is at one time or another of the flight. Even if it crashes, the equipment will let you know where, when, and eventually why. None of this is a case of Flight 370. 10 years later, no one knows what happened to him. In this video, we will try to solve the mystery of the missing Boeing. We will fully trace the chronology of the flight, study the reports, analyze the versions, and understand where the truth is most likely hiding. Okay, just in case, let's clarify a few technical details at once to avoid further confusion. The missing Malaysian Airlines plane had the code number MH370. This name appears in all English-language sources. In the Russian-speaking space, the name Flight 370 is most often found. I will use both options. The model of the missing Boeing 777 is one of the largest and most advanced types of airliners in the world. And there are 3 digits, and there are 7s. People far from aviation can get confused, so the first is the code of a specific aircraft. The second is the model of an aircraft manufactured by Boeing. In principle, this is all you need to know before we begin to dive into the story of the disappearance of Flight 370. The 8th of March, 2000 of the 14th year, is a quiet, clear night. Boeing 777 is preparing to take off from the airport of the Malaysian capital Kuala Lumpur. Destination Chinese Beijing is a daily flight for the company KID Airlines, about 5.5 hours of travel. According to the forecast, good weather conditions throughout the flight. Only a parazon of turbulence is expected. But this is not a problem for modern aircraft. The captain of the vessel MH370, Zahari Ahmad Shah. He is 53 years old. He spent more than 30 years on Malaysian Airlines aircraft, including the Boeing 777 model. A very experienced specialist with an ideal professional reputation, co-pilot Farik Abdul Hamid, 27 years old. His experience is small for 4 years. For Farik, this is a training flight on a Boeing Model 777. He made only a few flights on it. Nevertheless, the fact that the young man was able to get into the co-pilot's seat of a large airliner speaks of good professional qualities. In addition to 2 pilots, 10 crew members each have extensive work experience from 10 to 30 years. There are 227 passengers on board from around the world, but the vast majority are almost 2/3 Chinese citizens. Before takeoff, MH370, of course, was refueled with enough fuel for 7.5 hours of flight. That is, 2 hours more than necessary. This is standard practice and not the most interesting detail. However, given what happens later, even the most insignificant details become of some importance, including the amount of fuel refueled. Another important detail that you should definitely pay attention to is the timing at 0 hours and 40 minutes. Captain Zachary receives permission to take off. At hour 01, the Boeing rises to a cruising altitude of 35,000 feet, which is about 10.5 kilometers of cruising altitude in simple terms. This is the level at which the aircraft spends most of the flight. The captain's voice sounds quite natural and relaxed. His communication with the dispatcher on the ground goes according to plan. MH370 is perfectly visible to all radar, and the flight takes place in normal mode. Nothing suspicious. But after 7 minutes, strange things will begin to happen. At 1:08, Captain Zachary informs Earth that the plane is at an altitude of 35,000 feet. In this message, it is not its meaning that is strange, but the very fact of its existence. 7 minutes before that, the captain had already informed the ground that the plane was at an altitude of 35,000. The second message was clearly optional and suspicious. It could have appeared for several reasons, but we'll talk about them a little later, because right after this message, really amazing things begin to happen to the plane. 11 minutes later, Flight 370 is over the South China Sea. It leaves Malaysian airspace and enters Thai airspace. The Kuala Lumpur dispatcher sends Zachary to contact the Vietnamese dispatcher firm Ho Chi Minh City and says goodbye. Zachary says goodbye in a reply message, and this message is interesting for two reasons. First of all, the dispatcher said 5 digits in his farewell. This is the radio frequency. According to the rules, Zachary should have duplicated it, but he did not do it. And secondly, this message from the captain will be the last. The plane will never make contact with Vietnam. Almost immediately after that, the ship will disappear from the radar. At that moment, one of the main mysteries in the history of aviation began. Of course, the first thing that comes to mind when an airplane disappears from radar is that it just fell. However, as it turns out later, Flight 370 spent many more hours in the sky. Moreover, the place where the ship became inaccessible to radars, we can say, was ideal. The plane is no longer in the airspace of Malaysia, and it also seems to be not in the space of Vietnam. In short, this is the perfect moment if someone wanted to make the plane invisible. Everything that happened to the ship after it disappeared from radar is the main subject of investigations, speculation, and conspiracy theories. We will rely on the facts. And a lot of them have accumulated over the past 10 years. And first of all, it is necessary to clarify the meaning of the phrase disappeared from the radar. There are some technical details that are important for understanding the whole story. Throughout the entire flight, the passenger plane remains in radar visibility. These radars are divided into two types. The first one is the ones that look like huge vertically standing plates. Roughly speaking, they send a signal in the direction of the ship and read what is reflected from the object. This is a bit old-school technology and therefore not very accurate in terms of determining the position of the aircraft or speed. In addition, such radars have a limited range. Basically, the systems that monitor air traffic today rely on the second type of radar. They receive information from transponders on board the ship itself. The information includes the position, altitude, speed, and other indicators of the aircraft. Thanks to this system, for example, a website such as Flight Radar works. There, anyone can watch passenger planes that are in the sky anywhere in the world in real time. The problem with this technology is as follows. The aircraft will no longer be visible to this kind of radar if the transponders on board are out of order, or if someone has turned them off. Now let's go back to the events of that night on the 8th of March, 2014. What happened on Earth after the disappearance from the radar of Flight 370? The dispatcher in Kuala Lumpur didn't notice anything at first. Apparently, he was busy with other planes at that moment. When he finally discovered the absence of MH370 on the radar, he assumed that the plane was already outside his territory in the airspace of Vietnam. Vietnamese dispatchers at the same time recorded how Flight 370 got into their airspace and then disappeared from radar. According to the rules, they had to contact their colleagues in Kuala Lumpur within 5 minutes if the captain of Flight 370 did not establish contact with them. However, the Vietnamese did not do this. Instead, they themselves unsuccessfully tried to contact the ship for almost 20 minutes. And only after that they brought the information to the Malaysians. Dispatchers in Kuala Lumpur, in turn, contacted the company Malaysia Airlines, and they replied that everything was normal. According to them, the plane flies according to plan over the territory of Cambodia. As it turns out later, such data were based not on the actual position of the aircraft, but on a preliminary plan that the airline had. But around 2 o'clock in the morning, all sides agreed that the flight was going according to plan. And none of them noticed a subtle signal from those very old-school radars. According to them, the aircraft really continued to fly, however, in a completely different direction from the planned one. Due to the inattention of the dispatchers, no one notified the Malaysian aviation authorities about the loss of the plane within an hour, as it should be according to the rules. 4 more hours had passed before that moment. Only when the MH370 did not land at the specified time in Beijing, the situation became an emergency, and the plane was declared missing. They began to search for vessels in the South China Sea. This, in general, is logical. Communication with the liner was lost there. Several dozen planes and ships of Malaysia and Vietnam combed the sea space. However, no traces of MH370 were found. Only a few days after the disappearance, thanks to the collected radar readings of the first type as well as military radars, it became clear that flight MH370 first made a sharp, almost 180 degrees turn between Vietnam and Malaysia, crossed the territory of Malaysia, rounded Indonesia, and turned sharply to the south. After that, he flew for several more hours and finally disappeared. The trajectory of the ship's flight spoke of one thing: it was not an accident, not a technical breakdown. It was almost certainly a well-planned action. But why, for what purpose, and where finally the plane and 200 passengers? It's not easy to look for a needle in a haystack, but the real problem is when you don't even know where the drain is. This roughly describes the situation in which the Malaysian authorities found themselves when it became clear that the Boeing 777 did not fall in the South China Sea. And initially, information about the strange path of flight MH370 became known not from officials, but from journalists. Only after that, the Malaysian authorities confirmed the veracity of the media data. Some time later, the London company Inmarsat appeared in the history of the incident. They are engaged in commercial satellites, and passenger aviation, in general, is not their specialization. However, in this situation, it turned out that the data from Inmarsat satellites plus radar data on the ground can, with a high degree of probability, restore the full route of Flight 370, and at the same time exclude several of the most obvious versions of what happened. The entire Boeing journey can be divided into 2 parts. We know about the first one thanks to civilian and military radars, and the second one was restored by satellite. The route of the first part of the flight is 40 minutes before the transponders are turned off and another hour after that. No one doubts. And that's why it's important. The most obvious version of what happened initially was that an emergency situation occurred. Some systems failed, or there was an ignition, or some other emergency situation, and it disabled the very transponders on board that transmit information to Earth. Similar cases have happened. In the 2010 year, the cargo Boeing 747 of the UPS company crashed in Dubai. Due to a fire on board, the cause of the fire, as it turned out, was ignited lithium batteries, which the ship was carrying in cargo. In 1998, a passenger plane of Swiss Airlines crashed in Canada. The cause was a short circuit, which caused a fire and the failure of critical systems of the vessel. Flight MH370 also had cargo. Lithium batteries were part of it. As the investigation found out later, they could not have caused a fire and a crash because they were packed in a special way. But the main thing is that the very version of the fire that occurred on board due to cargo or a short circuit excluded the flight path and other details. The fact is that at the very moment when the transponders turned off and the plane disappeared from radar, it did not happen in one moment. First, one part of the transponder functionality was turned off, and after 37 seconds, they completely turned off. This means that the cause was not a sudden situation like a fire or explosion, but a manual gradual disconnection of transponders, most likely from the cockpit. In addition, a sharp turn of the ship by almost 180 degrees from the original route suggests that it was performed by someone manually. It couldn't have been autopilot. Subsequent tests showed that the plane on autopilot cannot perform such a sharp turn. Suppose there was a fire in the plane, which disabled the transponders, and the pilots turned around to land the plane urgently. But they didn't, they kept flying on. Moreover, on that first part of the route, which was recreated by radar, the aircraft continued to be manually controlled. This is indicated by slight fluctuations to the sides during the flight, and this, in turn, excludes the version of loss of consciousness by pilots, for example, due to smoke or cabin depressurization. According to Inmarsat satellites, the second part of the flight was restored after the MH370 disappeared from the field of view of ground radars. According to these data, the Boeing flew for another 6 hours at high speed and at high altitude towards Antarctica and finally disappeared in the southern Indian Ocean. However, all this information was not immediately known. Because of this, the search took place in absolutely the wrong places and, of course, led to nothing. Besides, time was lost. If the Malaysian authorities had immediately revealed information about the strange flight path of the vessel, then perhaps the plane could have been found. This is also why a lot of people, including some of the relatives of the passengers of the missing Boeing, are sure that the Malaysian authorities are covering up the true cause of what happened, that the plane may not have fallen at all or was shot down. We will talk about these versions a little later. Now let's focus on the search operation. It stretched over several years and became, according to some estimates, the most expensive and large-scale search operation in history. Planes and ships of several countries combed hundreds of square kilometers in 2 months. First in the South China Sea, then in the Andaman Sea, where the plane was last seen by radar, and finally in the southern Indian Ocean, where, according to Inmarsat, the plane disappeared completely. After 2 months of unsuccessful attempts, the search operation was focused on underwater research. Due to the fact that the Malaysians did not have enough resources to explore the depths of the Indian Ocean, Australians with more advanced equipment joined the operation in the proposed area. Their main task is to detect flight recorders from the cockpit. Several years have been spent. Hundreds of square kilometers of the seabed have been studied. It cost more than $100 million. And yet nothing has been found. After some time, the search was continued by the American commercial company Ocean Infinity. According to the agreement with the Malaysian authorities, search engines received remuneration only if the search was successful. But after several months of studying the bottom, nothing was found in the supposed fall area in the south of the Indian Ocean. In July 2015, 16 months after the disappearance of the plane, street cleaners on the island of Reunion in the Indian Ocean discovered a strange object. As it turned out later, this is part of the wing of a Boeing 777 aircraft called a flaperon. Thanks to the serial numbers on the flaperon, it became obvious that this piece was not just some Boeing 777, it was a piece of the same MH370. Subsequently, a total of 24 pieces of Boeing 777 were found on the coast of Madagascar and coastal territories nearby. Only a few of them can be accurately identified as the wreckage of MH370. The rest are determined by experts as most likely belonging to the missing plane. However, the wreckage found, by and large, did not report anything new about what had happened. Based on satellite data, it was almost certainly obvious that the plane crashed in the southern Indian Ocean. The analysis of currents in this region only confirmed that the wreckage was supposed to be carried somewhere to Southeast Africa. No traces of an explosion or fire were found on the wreckage. This only added weight to the theory that what happened to Flight 370 was arranged by a man. In the 2018 year, a huge report was published with the results of the investigation of the incident by the Malaysian authorities. 450 pages of the document, for the most part, duplicated the technical characteristics and features of the Boeing 777, the results of search operations and radar data. The document concluded that it was not possible to find out the true causes of the plane's disappearance, but even in this generally useless document, the authors recognized the disconnection of transponders and other detection systems on board the aircraft, most likely the work of a person. And you and I remember that the shutdown of these systems and the subsequent sharp turn of the ship occurred in the most ideal place to make the plane invisible. But who did it, and most importantly, why? Over the years of investigating the incident, many theories have emerged. Some of them were based on available facts and calculations. Such theories were most often proposed by former or current pilots or other professionals associated with aviation. They carefully analyzed the radar readings based on their own experience, and you have either already heard many of these arguments, or you will hear them during the video. However, at the same time, many other versions appeared. They can be called speculative or conspiratorial. Some of them became the basis for large documentaries about MH370, including, for example, on Netflix. So, one of the conspiracy scenarios suggests that the MH370 was initially shot down by the US military from the Diego Garcia base in the Indian Ocean, either because the ship initially wanted to attack this base or because the military shot down an unknown passenger plane that did not respond to their signals. After that, allegedly many radar data and debris were deliberately falsified to hide what happened. Another scenario even claims that the plane, after turning over Indonesia, flew not to the south, but to the north, and crashed somewhere over the territory of Kazakhstan. The problem with these theories is that the numbers contradict them. In the professional aviation community, and we are talking about specialists from around the world, there are no special discrepancies in the route of MH370, which was calculated mathematically using various satellites and radars. But what even experienced pilots cannot unequivocally say is what really happened to Flight 370. There are different versions here. Now we will look at them in detail. So, what we already know, based on the flight path of satellite and radar data, is that we are almost certainly dealing with a man-made act. Hardware failure or human error cannot explain what happened. Glitch of certain systems, icing, collisions with birds, lightning, meteorite, volcanic cloud, mechanical failure, electronic failure, equipment error, fire, smoke, explosion, depressurization, bomb, rocket. None of this can explain the journey that Flight 370 made. By the time the transponders were turned off, one of the pilots was most likely handling the ship. It's hard to believe that they acted together. For both of them, this was the first joint flight, which means that the pilot, who was not involved in the control at that moment, either could not get into the cockpit because it was closed, or was already unconscious. According to one version, the one who was at the helm, after the first sharp turn, rose to a height of 40,000 feet, while depressurizing the cabin. Oxygen masks 4 passengers in the cabin is only enough for 10 to 15 minutes. That is, they all lost consciousness quite quickly. At the same time, there is enough oxygen in the masks in the cockpit for pilots for several hours. In addition, at the moment when the plane abruptly changed course, not only the transponders were turned off, but also part of the other electrical systems of the aircraft, It is not known for what purpose, but it is likely that, among other things, the satellite communication systems with the aircraft were turned off, and it became completely invisible to dispatchers on the ground. If that was the case, then there was only one person left alive in the plane for the remaining 6 hours of the flight, and he was at the helm. Another fact speaks in favor of this theory. Almost an hour later, at 2:25, part of the electrical systems in the plane turned on again, including those responsible for connecting with the satellite. Partly due to this, it was later possible to restore the full route of the aircraft. In addition to the switched-on electrical systems, the cabin of the aircraft was sealed again. For everyone on board, except for the man at the helm, it didn't make sense. None of them were alive in that case. In other words, we still have a question. Who was at the helm? Was one of the pilots, or was the plane hijacked? Hijackings of planes are not that common, but alas, it happens. Surely one of you has watched a video about DP Cooper on my channel, or knows the story of the 11th of September. Yes, and besides, there are many such cases in the history of aviation. But with the passage of time, security measures have constantly increased, and it is almost impossible for an outsider to get into the cockpit. On that Boeing model in the 2014, the door to the cockpit was equipped with many degrees of protection, plus video surveillance, so that the pilots could see who was standing at the door. In addition, the first disappearance of the aircraft from radar occurred a few minutes after Captain Zachary casually said goodbye to the dispatcher. It is unlikely that any of the passengers could have hijacked the plane during this time. In addition, I said that the disappearance and sharp turn of the plane occurred at the most ideal moment, between two airspace of different countries. It is unlikely that the kidnappers could have chosen such a suitable moment. But let's assume that the kidnappers still managed to get into the cockpit. In order for the captain or co-pilot to be able to report this to the ground or transmit the appropriate signal, it takes only a few moments. But they didn't. One of the versions about the abduction of MH370 suggests that the kidnappers could turn off the transponders and part of the systems by sneaking into a room under the floor in the cabin of the aircraft, where many systems and sensors are actually located. However, it is difficult to imagine that this happened unnoticed by more than 200 people on board. In addition, most of the investigation of the incident was devoted to studying the identity of all 239 people on board, including crew members. In addition to the Malaysians, the FBI also participated in this. As a result, 2 passengers were found who were flying on fake passports. However, further investigation revealed that the 2 passengers were Iranian citizens and had no connection with any terrorist organizations. Most likely, they were just trying to get to one of the more or less safe countries and then ask for political asylum. And finally, what is the purpose of hijacking the plane? A terrorist attack, money, or politics? Everything that happened SMIC 374 7 hours of flight shows that none of this most likely was the cause. In addition, no one has claimed responsibility for the incident. And anonymity is not a damn thing for terrorists. And so we don't have many versions left, or rather one. The incident was organized by one of the pilots. But who and why? Here it would not be superfluous to mention another conspiracy theory. There is an idea that the plane was actually controlled manually all the time, but from the ground. According to this version, either Boeing was experimenting with a new technology, or someone managed to simply hack the ship's control system. Both ideas are not taken seriously by pilots or other industry professionals. Firstly, because even theoretically it is quite difficult to present data about the scenario, and secondly, the analysis of flight data suggests that the control took place directly from the cockpit. Thus, we turn to the discussion of those who were initially at the controls of the aircraft: Captain Zahari Akhmatshah and co-pilot Farik Abdul Hamid. Pilots are not robots. Pilots are real people. Those who sit at the helm can also experience psychological problems, go through difficult moments of life, experience financial difficulties, and so on. All of this could potentially be the reason why one or another pilot may steal an airplane, or decide to end his life while performing professional duties. This is confirmed by real cases from the history of civil aviation. In the 2014 year, an Ethiopian Airlines plane with 200 passengers was hijacked by the co-pilot. The ship was flying from the Ethiopian capital to Milan, Italy. During the flight, the captain went to the toilet, the co-pilot blocked the door to the cockpit and took control. Then he landed in Switzerland and requested political asylum. None of the passengers were injured. In 1999, an Egyptian Airlines Boeing flight from New York to Cairo crashed into the ocean 30 minutes after the flight. American researchers concluded that it was a deliberate act on the part of the co-pilot, who turned off the engines and sent the plane down. More than 200 people on board died. In the 2015 year, the plane of the company Jorman Winds from Barcelona to Dusseldorf abruptly began to decline and fell in the Alps. As the investigation later found out, it was a deliberate action of the pilot. He blocked the door to the cockpit after the captain went to the toilet and sent the plane down. Almost 150 people were killed. The reason for the co-pilot's behavior was serious mental problems that he hid from the airline. And these are not all such cases, but only a few examples. Therefore, during the investigation, the pilots were checked especially carefully. Their biographies, medical records, relatives and bank accounts, houses and apartments. The co-pilot was 27-year-old Farik Abdulhamid. No details of his life suggested that he could have committed a deliberate act of wreckage. His finances and health were in perfect order. He described with all his acquaintances as an optimistic young man. Besides, he was supposed to be getting married soon. From a professional point of view, everything was still good in Farik's life. As I said, he was only recently entrusted with the pilot's seat in the Boeing 770. This is a huge liner, and it is prestigious to get such an appointment at a young age. He had a great career ahead of him. The only suspicious moment regarding the co-pilot is his phone, the Malaysian investigators' report said. That after the plane abruptly turned around from the planned route, the co-pilot's iPhone suddenly turned on. It happened over the island of Penang, and communication with the phone was established for a very short period of time. It wasn't an outgoing or incoming call. The phone tower on the island only recorded a connection with the device. What can it tell us? According to the rules, pilots' phones must be turned off during the flight. So, someone turned on the co-pilot's phone already in the sky. Perhaps it was him to call and report something. But this is just a guess. The true reason for the short contact from the ground with the pilot's phone is unknown. Interestingly, information about Farik's iPhone appeared in the press thanks to the leaking of the materials of the Malaysian investigation. Many of these materials were never published and did not make it into the final 400-page report. Why? An interesting question to which there is no exact answer. The Malaysian authorities, of course, are known for their corruption and lack of transparency, but why hide such facts is unclear. Anyway, we don't even have indirect data that would indicate that the co-pilot wanted to commit an intentional act. Therefore, we proceed to discuss the figure of the ship's Captain Zahari Akmatshah. Let me remind you that he was a very experienced pilot for 53 years. Of these, he flew more than 30 on various Malaysian Airlines planes since '98. Zachary was just a captain on a Boeing Model 777. The pilot has an ideal professional reputation. He is married with 3 children. As investigators found out, his finances and health were in perfect order. Colleagues characterized Zahari positively. He was stress-resistant. There was nothing suspicious about his behavior before the flight. Investigators also carefully analyzed the videos from the airport before the flight. On them, the pose of the facial expression and other signs do not betray any deviations in Zachar. In his spare time, the pilot was engaged in amateur electronics and flew on a home flight simulator. Zachary even had his own YouTube channel. In a word, the ship's captain also seemed to have no motives for committing a terrible act. However, many details from the flight analysis suggested that the captain is the main suspect. The Malaysian authorities' report on the pilot aroused suspicion among many. The fact is that articles began to appear in the media that everything was not easy in the captain's personal life. He allegedly lived separately from his wife and had mistresses. It is worth noting here that these rumors were not publicly confirmed by Zachariah's relatives. What was really strange was the flight simulator found in the pilot's house. It was not the very fact of the presence of such a device that was suspicious, but the flights that Zachary performed on this simulator. Among the hundreds of stored and deleted flight data, the investigators' attention was drawn to a route that ended in the southern Indian Ocean, and quite closely resembled the real route of MH370, recreated by radar and satellite. That is, the captain may have rehearsed this fatal flight on his simulator. After all, as I have already noticed, many aviation industry professionals agree that everything that happened with Boeing was well prepared. What makes the data from Zachari's flight simulator even more strange is the fact that information about such a flight was leaked to the press from a non-public report of the Malaysian authorities. They only later admitted that a strange route on the flight simulator took place. Moreover, it was deleted initially by Zachary himself and restored later by investigators. In the official report, the Malaysian authorities conclude that this was not an attempt to rehearse the last flight of the MH370, and some independent researchers agree with this. In their opinion, this is just a coincidence. On the other hand, if it wasn't a coincidence, it turns out that Zachary really rehearsed the route of Flight 370. As other independent researchers have found out, there is no landing point in this flight on the simulator, unlike hundreds of others. In theory, the meaning of the simulator is that the person at the helm takes off, reaches the desired point, and lands at a particular airport. But in the case of this Zachary flight, there was no landing point on the simulator. One thing becomes obvious from this: the fact that Zachary was the main suspect in the incident for some time is absolutely clear. But we cannot say for sure that it was he who committed the moderate hijacking of Flight 370 and was responsible for its death. We do not have enough concrete evidence for this. There are only indirect conclusions. One thing is clear for sure: the person who did this was very well prepared and knew what to do. And although data from several different researchers confirm the approximate crash zone of the aircraft in the Indian Ocean, we do not have an exact answer as to how the last stage of the flight went. Whether it was a gradual fall of the vessel due to fuel consumption or a more abrupt man-made act of lowering the vessel and colliding with the ground. This is important enough to understand the motives. It is obvious that the person who sat at the helm during the entire flight actively and intentionally performed the necessary actions. He turned the plane around in the right places, turned off the electronics, moved away from the radar area as much as possible. Did he just passively wait for the plane to run out of fuel at the last stage? And yet, according to some calculations, the plane was gradually descending and was not sharply directed downwards. At the same time, some other calculations say quite the opposite. But what we know almost for sure is that the last hours of Flight MH370 have already passed in daylight. And this means that the one who sat at the helm, most likely the only living person on board, watched as a new day begins. To date, the investigation of the incident and the search for Flight MH370 have been stopped. Not a single body was ever found, and no wreckage except for those 20 that do not add clarity to the situation. This means that neither the relatives of the passengers nor the rest of the world know the exact causes of the circumstances of the crash. The only hope to find out the final truth is to find more wreckage of Flight MH370. However, given the vast expanse of ocean that needs to be explored, and the hundreds of millions of dollars that need to be spent on it again, the prospect of resuming the search is quite unlikely. And in the case of Flight 370, most likely, it will remain one of the main mysteries in the history of aviation.